The night was thick, almost tangible, a humid blanket pressed against Che Guevara's skin as he moved silently through the dense Bolivian jungle. Each step was a careful negotiation with roots that threatened to trip him, with the mud that clung to his boots like a warning. The moon, a thin crescent high above, barely cut through the heavy canopy. Even here, far from Havana, far from the warmth of his comrades in Cuba, the sense of being hunted never left him. He could feel it in the air, the weight of unseen eyes, the subtle shift of the wind, the faint sound of movement that might, or might not, be human. Che paused, crouched behind a massive tree, listening. Somewhere nearby, a branch snapped. His hand instinctively reached for the pistol strapped to his chest, fingers brushing the cold metal. A local boy, probably no older than 14, emerged from the undergrowth, carrying a bundle of food wrapped in banana leaves. Che relaxed just slightly, offering a nod that barely disturbed the shadows on his face. Trust was a fragile thing these days, but the locals had always been loyal, at least those who had not been bought or threatened by the ever-encroaching reach of the Americans. He took the bundle, unwrapping it slowly, aware that even the act of eating could be dangerous. Every chew, every swallow, seemed to echo in the silent forest, a reminder that one wrong sound could cost him his life. Che had long understood the paradox of being a hero, admired by millions in the newspapers and whispered legends, yet hunted like a common fugitive. Across continents, from Langley to Buenos Aires, his name sparked both fear and obsession. The CIA had made it personal. He was no longer just a revolutionary. He was a target, a symbol, a prize they would stop at nothing to capture or destroy. Sitting on the damp earth, Che allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. His mind drifted to the faces of fallen comrades, young men and women who had believed in the dream of equality and justice, now reduced to names on tattered memorials. How many more would die before the world recognized what he was fighting for? And yet, despite the fear, the exhaustion, the gnawing paranoia, there remained a stubborn fire within him. It was this fire that kept him moving, that guided his steps through foreign jungles, through cities crawling with informants and traitors alike. He was a ghost, and ghosts were hard to kill. He thought of coded messages, arriving sporadically via trusted contacts. Letters hidden in the lining of jackets, folded newspapers passed hand to hand, whispers in crowded markets. Each message carried vital intelligence. Safe houses, enemy movements, betrayals. And yet, there was always uncertainty. How many of these messages were traps? How many were manipulated by the invisible hands of the CIA, seeking to draw him out into the open? Every choice was a gamble, every night, a dance on the knife's edge. A sudden rustle in the leaves snapped him from his thoughts. Che froze, heart pounding, eyes scanning the darkness. He heard the distant echo of a gunshot, not aimed at him, thankfully, but enough to remind him of the constant presence of danger. Somewhere, agents were moving, tracking him with cold precision. He could almost imagine the map in the CIA briefing room, pins marking his location, analysts debating the best way to close in. And yet, he moved on, weaving through the jungle with a rhythm born of both fear and experience. This was his life now, a constant negotiation with death, an endless puzzle where every piece could be lethal. The young boy who had delivered his food lingered for a moment, curiosity flashing in his eyes. Che's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "Go home," he whispered. "Quickly. They are everywhere." The boy hesitated, then disappeared into the shadows. Che remained crouched, blending into the darkness, listening to the chorus of nocturnal life. Frogs croaked, insects buzzed, leaves whispered in the wind. And beneath it all, a hum of tension, an invisible thread connecting him to the hunters miles away, in offices filled with coffee and cigarette smoke, plotting his capture with the detachment of men who had never felt the weight of fear on their skin. Hours passed. Che moved again, silent as the jungle night allowed, until he reached a small clearing where the remains of an abandoned shack offered temporary refuge. He sank to the ground, fatigue pressing on him like a heavy cloak. His hands, calloused and worn, traced the edges of a map spread before him, lines and circles marking paths, safe zones, and potential ambush points. The world was smaller than he remembered, yet larger in its capacity for danger. And everywhere, the shadow of the CIA loomed. Everywhere, but here, in this brief pocket of silence, he was free to breathe. But freedom was fleeting. Even here he could sense it, the paranoia, the pressure, the weight of being the most wanted man in the world. Every movement could be his last. Every decision carried the gravity of life and death. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, there was clarity. Che was a man defined by action, by conviction. The hunt would continue, but so would he. The world might see him as a legend, an icon, a myth, but in the quiet moments like this, crouched in the shadows of the Bolivian jungle, he was simply Ernesto Guevara, a man, a fugitive, a fighter, and a soul unwilling to surrender. The night stretched on, dark and oppressive, and Che disappeared into its depths, a ghost among the trees, a spark of defiance that could not be snuffed. Somewhere, far away, analysts plotted his capture. Somewhere else, allies prayed for his survival. And in the jungle, he moved like a shadow, untouchable and yet painfully real, both a symbol and a man, hunted and yet unbroken. Somewhere deep in Langley, Virginia, the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint hiss of air conditioning filled the CIA operations room. The smell of stale coffee and printer ink hung in the air, mixing with a quiet tension that had become routine over the past months. Analysts bent over maps and photographs, the glow of monitors illuminating faces strained with focus. At the center of the room, a large map of South America dominated the wall, red pushpins marking areas of insurgent activity. One pushpin burned brighter than all the rest, Bolivia. And pinned to it, like a magnet for obsession, was the name that haunted every briefing: Ernesto Che Guevara. Special Agent Harold Kane, mid-40s, face lined with years of fieldwork, leaned over a map strewn with notes. He tapped a finger against a small village in eastern Bolivia. "He's moving again," he muttered. "They've got reports of him in the region near Camiri. This isn't a pattern. He's unpredictable, damn it, he's smart." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the task pressing down on every agent present. They weren't just hunting a man, they were hunting a symbol, a living embodiment of rebellion, a legend whose capture promised a political triumph as much as a tactical one. Every piece of intelligence was examined, dissected, and debated. Every report was filtered through suspicion. Every ally could be a traitor, every message a trap. It was in this crucible of paranoia that the double agents thrived. Shadows within shadows, men and women whose loyalties were fluid, whose whispers could tip the scales of life and death. One such agent, known only by the codename Silver Fox, had recently been feeding information from Che's inner circle to the Americans. Yet even as the CIA celebrated these small victories, there was always uncertainty. Could Silver Fox be feeding false information to trap them? Were they themselves pawns in a larger game? Kane's eyes narrowed at a photograph, a grainy image of a man, hat pulled low, moving through a marketplace. "This is him. No doubt. We need confirmation before we act." His voice carried the cold precision of a man trained to think of humans as variables, as patterns, as data points. And yet, beneath the surface, a trace of admiration lingered. Che Guevara wasn't just smart, he was almost impossibly smart. He moved like a shadow, leaving only fragments of evidence behind, and always stayed one step ahead. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Che's network was similarly entangled in webs of uncertainty. Trusted contacts sent coded messages via obscure channels, letters stitched into clothing, signals hidden in newspaper classifieds, whispered instructions passed in crowded markets. Every message was a lifeline, yet every message carried the possibility of betrayal. One misstep could lead to disaster. One wrong choice could lead the CIA straight to their doorstep. Che knew this, and he thrived on it. The paranoia that gripped him was not just fear, it was sharpened awareness. He could sense when someone was lying, when the air carried the scent of deception. And still, human frailty crept in. Doubt gnawed at him like a persistent shadow. Could someone close, someone he had trusted with his life, be feeding the enemy? The thought was unbearable, yet it was real. Every movement, every decision had to account for this uncertainty. Back in Langley, Kane convened a quiet meeting with his most trusted analysts. They pored over intercepted communications, decoded messages, and reports from local informants. The tension in the room was palpable. "We need a break," muttered one analyst, rubbing his eyes. "We're chasing ghosts." Kane's jaw tightened. "No, we're chasing a legend. Legends aren't caught by chance. They're caught by precision, patience, and patience alone. Every agent, every wiretap, every informant is a thread. We follow the threads, and eventually we'll reach him." But the threads were tangled, and the maze of deception ran deep. One of their most reliable sources had gone silent for 2 days, raising suspicion of compromise. Another had been spotted speaking with a local revolutionary sympathizer in Santa Cruz. Every contact was a potential threat. Every piece of intelligence was colored with doubt. Kane felt the tension, like a physical weight pressing on his chest. This was not just a hunt. It was a mental battlefield, a war of nerves played across continents. Meanwhile, the double agents moved with quiet efficiency. Silver Fox passed along fragments of Che's movements, false trails carefully interspersed with genuine locations. The CIA mobilized, sending operatives to intercept, only to find empty campsites, abandoned villages, and footprints fading into the jungle mud. Frustration and admiration mingled in equal measure. Che's brilliance was infuriating, almost poetic in its cruelty. He led them in a dance they could not control, yet every misstep they made brought them closer to understanding him. In Bolivia, Che sensed the tightening noose. He had been warned of unusual activity along his expected route, and his instincts screamed caution. That night, as he crouched beside a river, listening to the water's gentle flow, he considered the invisible net cast by the CIA. He understood the mind of his pursuers, the cold logic that drove them, the belief that every man, even a legend, could be cornered. And he knew that in this game, the stakes were higher than politics. They were life itself. Che allowed himself a brief, ironic smile. Let them come. Let them chase. Every agent, every informant, every double agent was a piece on his chessboard, and he had always been several moves ahead. But he could not ignore the exhaustion, the gnawing paranoia, the loneliness of being hunted. He whispered to himself, a vow more than a thought: "I will not fall easily. Not yet. Not while I breathe." As the night deepened, the CIA's monitors flickered with the movement of distant figures, the hum of radios, the static-laced voices of field agents. Somewhere in the Bolivian jungle, Che moved like a shadow among shadows, aware that every step was watched, every breath measured, every moment fraught with danger. And somewhere in Langley, Kane's eyes followed the map, tracking the ghost of a man who had become more than flesh and blood, a legend, a threat, a mystery that refused to be solved. The game had begun, and neither side could afford to falter. The jungle seemed to close in on Che Guevara as if it were alive, a breathing, watchful entity. Every leaf shimmered in the humid night air. Every branch became a potential snare. The distant sound of a machete cutting through underbrush made him freeze, muscles coiled like a spring. For a man who had fought in cities, mountains, and plains, the jungle presented its own merciless terrain, unforgiving, silent, and full of hidden predators, both human and otherwise. Che moved with deliberate care, feeling the mud suck at his boots, the sweat rolling down his back in thin rivulets. His senses were heightened to an almost unbearable level. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth made him flinch, heart hammering. The CIA was closer now than he dared admit, using local informants, aerial reconnaissance, and their intricate network of double agents to close in. The hunt was not only relentless, it was intimate. They knew he would slip through the obvious paths. They were expecting ingenuity, and Che intended to deliver it. A narrow stream appeared ahead, the water swollen from recent rains. Che paused, kneeling to drink, aware that the slightest noise could give him away. He tasted the cold, earthy water, feeling a moment of calm in the midst of the storm. It was fleeting. Across the bank, a faint glimmer caught his eye, a reflection of moonlight on a distant figure moving silently along the ridge. Instinct screamed that it was no ordinary traveler. Adrenaline surged. Every nerve in his body told him, they are near. Che's mind raced through possibilities. A direct confrontation was impossible. The terrain favored the hunter as much as the hunted, and he could not risk the lives of the locals who sheltered him. He needed misdirection. He crouched low, letting the shadows swallow him, listening as the figure advanced, then veered off, probably following a false trail. The psychological battle was as critical as the physical one. He had to make them doubt themselves as much as they tried to make him falter. Hours stretched into an eternity as Che pressed deeper into the jungle. His movements were precise, each footfall measured to minimize sound. He navigated by memory, by instinct, and by the faint markings left on trees by his allies. But the exhaustion was real. Sleep was a distant memory. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and yet the pressure to keep moving never eased. Each night brought the same agonizing uncertainty. Would he find the safe house? Would the path be compromised? Would someone he trusted betray him under duress or threat? The sounds of pursuit were subtle, branches breaking in the distance, a faint cough of human breath, the occasional ripple of water that should have been still. Che forced himself to remain calm, to think several moves ahead. He remembered lessons from Cuba, from guerrilla campaigns in the Sierra Maestra. Move unpredictably, trust few, rely on instinct. And yet, in moments like these, even a legend felt the crushing weight of vulnerability. The idealism that had carried him across continents now collided with the harsh reality of being hunted. Suddenly, a low whistle cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. Che ducked behind a fallen log, barely breathing. His eyes scanned the undergrowth. Shadows moved, then froze. He realized a trap had been set, a minor diversion to test his movements, a probe to gauge his response. Che's lips pressed into a thin line. He would not walk into a trap, not tonight, not ever. Slowly, he retraced his steps, slipping along an alternative path known only to his inner circle, one so convoluted it would confuse even the most diligent tracker. The jungle seemed to close around him again, the foliage growing thicker, oppressive. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging, but he could not stop. Hunger clawed at his stomach. Fatigue threatened to bend his knees. Yet he pressed on, moving through the dense underbrush with the quiet precision of a man whose life depended on each calculated step. Somewhere far above, the hum of an approaching helicopter reminded him that the reach of his enemies extended beyond human senses, that technology and manpower were arrayed against him. Che stumbled into a small clearing where the remnants of an abandoned hut offered temporary shelter. He crouched behind the crumbling walls, listening to the forest around him. The distant murmur of voices suggested agents passing by, searching methodically, believing they had followed his trail. A bitter smile touched his lips. Let them follow. Let them tire themselves out. Every misstep they made was his advantage. He allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, to plan the next leg of the journey. Maps and coordinates swirled in his mind, every safe house, every river crossing, every ridge memorized. Each movement was a dance with death, choreographed by decades of experience, instinct, and sheer willpower. And beneath it all, a gnawing, emotional tension persisted. He missed the camaraderie of his Cuban comrades, the simplicity of shared purpose. Here, in the hostile wilderness, alone and hunted, every step reminded him of the cost of his ideals. A sudden sound, a twig snapping unnaturally close, snapped him to full alert. He pressed against the shadows, muscles taut, breath shallow. There, just a few meters away, a pair of men moved cautiously, scanning the undergrowth. Che's pulse accelerated, but his mind remained cold, calculating. A careful diversion, a displaced stone here, a shadow cast over the wrong path there. And he vanished, leaving only the whispers of the jungle to mark his passage. By dawn, Che had covered miles of treacherous terrain. His body ached, his eyes burned, but the thought of surrender never crossed his mind. The hunt had pushed him to the edge of human endurance, yet it had also sharpened him. He was alive, unbroken, and for now invisible. Somewhere behind him, agents would regroup, retrace paths, and plot again. Somewhere ahead, allies awaited, hidden and vigilant. And in the moments of brief, precarious safety, Che allowed himself a silent vow. They could chase him across continents, through forests and mountains, but they would never truly catch the legend. The jungle was silent again, except for the distant cries of birds awakening to the dawn. Che paused on a narrow ridge, watching the first slivers of sunlight pierce the foliage. The world beyond this forest was vast and dangerous, yet it was a world he would navigate with a cunning resilience and defiance that had defined him from the beginning. The chase continued. The cat and mouse game had only just begun. The world outside the jungle had a very different rhythm, one measured not by footsteps in the mud or whispers in the trees, but by headlines, radio broadcasts, and flickering images on black and white television screens. Che Guevara was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a legend whose name carried weight far beyond the forests of Bolivia. Governments, intelligence agencies, and media outlets debated him, dissected him, feared him. And the CIA, ever aware of the power of perception, waged a campaign not only to capture him, but to define him. In Washington, analysts prepared carefully crafted dossiers. El Che, they called him, painting the picture of a dangerous revolutionary, a man who threatened stability across Latin America. Leaflets were printed, radio scripts rehearsed, photographs distributed, each carefully selected to emphasize his ruthlessness, to sow fear among local populations, and to undermine the revolutionary narrative he represented. Every newspaper article, every bulletin, every whisper in the press became a tool of the hunt. The CIA understood that controlling the story could be as decisive as controlling the terrain. But Che's own team was equally aware of the battle for hearts and minds. Propaganda was not only a weapon in the hands of the hunter, it was a shield for the hunted. Radio transmissions from hidden locations countered the narrative, presenting Che as a hero of the oppressed, a man fighting for equality and justice. Leaflets circulated among villages, carrying messages of hope, resistance, and the promise of change. In every word, Che's ideals were distilled, a reminder that even while being hunted, his revolution could not be erased. Che himself often considered the strange power of perception. From the heart of the jungle, crouched behind a thicket, he would listen to the crackle of a radio or intercept a conversation between villagers. He knew how fragile truth was, how easily it could be twisted. To survive, one had to manipulate not just bodies, but minds. The same intelligence that guided him through the forest now guided him through a war of images and ideas. The tension of this invisible battlefield was suffocating. Every message, every broadcast could be a trap. One miscalculated word might expose his location or mislead allies. Che's paranoia, honed by months of evading capture, extended beyond the jungle. He scrutinized every contact, every courier, every signal. Trust was scarce, and suspicion was a necessity. Yet even amid the uncertainty, he felt the strange exhilaration of the intellectual duel. The CIA thought of him as prey. He thought of them as pieces in a larger, unpredictable game. Back in Langley, Special Agent Kane studied the feedback from field agents and media reports. Some narratives were working. Local populations fearful of reprisal or convinced of Che's ruthlessness. Others, however, were backfiring, inadvertently amplifying his image as a hero and martyr. Kane leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "He's not just a man," he muttered. "He's an idea. And ideas are dangerous. They spread faster than bullets." Amid this battle of perception, the jungle remained silent but ever present. Che moved cautiously, aware that any local who spoke too freely, any messenger who misstepped, could betray him. He thought of the villagers, whose lives were intertwined with his survival. Their trust was sacred. And yet, in a world dominated by spies, double agents, and propagandists, trust was always a calculated risk. One false step could lead to tragedy. In one makeshift safe house, Che and a small circle of trusted lieutenants gathered around a crude radio transmitter. Messages were encoded in subtle language, designed to inspire hope without giving away location. Each broadcast carried both tactical and symbolic weight. Instructions to sympathizers, warnings to enemy informants, and above all, a reaffirmation of the ideals that had propelled him across continents. The room was tense, every crackle of static a reminder that the enemy might be listening. Yet the energy was palpable, an intoxicating mix of fear, hope, and defiance. The propaganda war also exacted an emotional toll. Che reflected on the paradox of his existence. Adored by millions he had never met, vilified by powerful institutions determined to erase him. The admiration was a comfort, the vilification a burden. It was exhausting to be both myth and man, symbol and fugitive. He wondered if the world would ever see him as he truly was, a man driven by ideals, yet human, vulnerable, and flawed. The CIA, for its part, continued to refine its methods. Leaflets were dropped from planes, radio frequencies jammed, misinformation disseminated to confuse local populations. But for every step they took, Che countered with subtlety and cunning, using local knowledge, improvisation, and the loyalty of those who believed in his cause. The cat-and-mouse game had expanded from the physical to the psychological, each side attempting to outmaneuver the other in a deadly dance of perception and deception. One night, as Che crouched near a riverbank, he listened to the wind rustle through the trees and reflected on the surreal nature of his existence. He was hunted, yet he was free, vilified, yet revered, hunted not just across the land, but across the minds of men. And in that paradox, he found a strange strength. The CIA could chase him across mountains and jungles, spread propaganda to demonize him, and manipulate the narrative, but they could not capture the essence of what he had become. Che whispered to himself, a quiet affirmation of defiance. They can control the story, but not the soul. They can hunt the body, but the idea is untouchable. The dawn broke over the jungle, light filtering through the canopy in thin, gold threads. The world beyond was engaged in a war of images, of lies and truths, of narratives shaped and reshaped by fear and hope. But here, in the midst of the dense foliage, Che moved with the knowledge that every broadcast, every leaflet, every story written about him was part of the battlefield, a battlefield where survival depended on intelligence, intuition, and the unbreakable will to continue. And the hunt went on, as relentless and invisible as the wind through the trees. The jungle was deceptively calm that night, a soft chorus of crickets and frogs masking the unease that had settled deep in Che Guevara's chest. He had learned long ago that peace in these moments was never natural. It was a warning, an illusion. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every whisper of wind carried suspicion. The hunt was not just physical, it was psychological. And tonight, the danger would come not from the CIA or distant operatives, but from within. Che moved quietly through the undergrowth, aware that one misstep could spell disaster. His mind kept replaying the last coded message he had received, the subtle hints that something was off. For weeks, his team had been unusually tense. Instructions had been delayed, messages misdirected. Supplies went missing, only to reappear in altered states. Che's instincts screamed that the patterns were deliberate, and that in the quiet spaces between loyalty and fear, betrayal had found a foothold. He reached the small clearing where his closest lieutenants gathered. Faces that had once seemed unshakable now flickered with uncertainty, a flicker too subtle for the untrained eye but impossible for Che to miss. He greeted them with his usual calm, but inside, a storm raged. There was no room for hesitation here. One wrong assessment could undo everything. As they settled into the hut, Che's eyes met those of one of his most trusted aides, a man named Luis. Luis had been with him since Cuba, a companion through revolutions and campaigns, a man who had shared the blood and the victories. Yet tonight, there was a tension in Luis's posture, a nervous twitch that did not go unnoticed. Che watched him quietly, observing the flick of an eye, the shifting of a hand, the way he avoided meeting certain gazes. The signs were subtle, but Che's instincts were honed to detect even the faintest tremor of deception. Everything is ready for tomorrow's move? Che asked casually, though his mind probed deeper. Luis hesitated, a fraction too long. Yes, everything, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Che nodded slowly, accepting the answer at face value while mentally cataloging every detail. Later, alone in the hut, he pored over the maps and notes again, tracing the planned escape routes with a finger. He thought of the dangers ahead, the CIA operatives, the double agents, the treacherous terrain. And then, the realization hit with the force of a gunshot. Someone in his inner circle had been leaking information. Someone he trusted. The betrayal was almost unbearable. It was one thing to be hunted by agents in Langley or soldiers in Bolivia. It was entirely another to have the enemy inside your own ranks. Che's mind raced through possibilities. How long had it been happening? How much had the CIA learned from these leaks? And most importantly, could the traitor be turned, or was the line between loyalty and fear irrevocably crossed? The next morning, the jungle was shrouded in mist. Che moved with a purpose, testing the terrain, guiding his team along a seemingly secure path. Yet his mind was focused on one question: who could he trust? Every step forward was a mental exercise in caution. A misread gesture, a hesitated command, a faltered glance. Each could reveal the spy among them. As they neared a river crossing, Che noticed a subtle irregularity, a footprint, slightly off from the path they had cleared the night before. His pulse quickened. Someone had been there. He turned to Luis casually, watching for any reaction. Luis's hand twitched, brushing against the edge of his jacket. Che's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, catching emotion. That night, Che confronted him quietly, away from the others. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the distant rush of water over stones. Luis, Che began, his voice calm but cold, we need to speak honestly. There are cracks forming in our operations. Tell me, what are you hiding? Luis's face paled. For a moment, he looked like a man caught in a current too strong to resist. Che, his voice faltered. I had no choice. They threatened my family. They said, if I didn't, Che's jaw tightened. The betrayal was devastating, but he understood fear. Loyalty under threat was fragile. Even the strongest men could fracture. You endangered all of us, he said quietly, the weight of his words settling like stones in the dark. Do you understand what that could have cost? Luis swallowed hard, tears glinting in the dim light. I did what I had to, Ernesto. I never meant. Che cut him off. Intentions do not erase consequences. You will stay close. I will watch. One more misstep, one more shadow, and it will not matter what you meant. Survival depends on trust, and trust has been broken. Luis nodded, broken but alive. The emotional weight of the confrontation lingered, and Che felt a cold, familiar resolve settle over him. Betrayal within one's inner circle was a dagger, but it was a reality of being a hunted man, a symbol, a legend. He could forgive, but he could not allow weakness to compromise the mission. That night, as he lay in a concealed hammock, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, Che reflected on the fragility of human loyalty. Fear could twist the strongest bonds. Desperation could make traitors of friends. And yet, amid the turmoil, he reaffirmed a simple truth. The hunt would continue, and he would survive. Betrayal was a shadow he had to carry, but it would not break him. The jungle seemed quieter than usual, but Che knew better. Danger never rested. It moved in silence, in whispers, in subtle gestures. The CIA would press forward, and Luis's actions had only underscored the peril of complacency. Che was alive, but the cost of survival was etched into his mind: vigilance, caution, and the painful acknowledgement that even the closest ally could falter. With the first light of dawn filtering through the dense canopy, Che rose, resolved. The game had changed. The enemy was not only outside the forest, but sometimes inside it, and he would move with renewed focus, sharper than ever. The hunt was far from over, and in this jungle of shadows and treachery, every choice could be the difference between life and death. The legend pressed on, hunted but unbroken, aware that in a world of betrayal, cunning was the only true ally. The map spread before Che Guevara was more than lines and dots. It was a living, breathing puzzle. Rivers cut through mountains, roads snaked around cities, borders marked by shifting loyalties and fragile alliances. Che traced his finger along the path he had chosen, the route that would carry him across Bolivia, into Argentina, and perhaps further. Every step had to be measured, every crossing calculated. The CIA was no longer a distant threat. Their reach extended across borders, aided by local informants, double agents, and governments willing to trade his capture for political favor. The journey began at dawn. Che moved with the skill of a ghost, slipping through forests, evading patrols, and using the terrain as both shield and weapon. Local villagers whispered directions, warned of patrols, and offered fleeting supplies. Their trust was earned, fragile and precious, and Che moved with respect, aware that a single mistake could cost lives. Crossing into Argentina was a calculated risk. Borders were monitored, checkpoints staffed, yet the flow of commerce and travel offered cover for someone who knew the nuances of disguise and timing. Che adopted multiple identities, blending seamlessly into marketplaces and dusty roads. He watched the soldiers, their eyes scanning, noting movement, unaware that the man they sought was walking just beyond their gaze, observing them as intently as they observed him. Every night brought exhaustion and reflection. Che found temporary shelters, abandoned cabins, attics, or the sparse homes of sympathetic locals. He wrote letters he could never send. Thoughts poured onto scraps of paper that might never reach human eyes. In these quiet moments, he allowed himself to feel the weight of isolation. Across continents, the hunt was relentless, and the loneliness was crushing. The friends he had known in Cuba, the comrades lost to revolution and betrayal, they were ghosts that haunted him as surely as the agents tracking his every move. Yet the physical challenges were matched by psychological pressure. The CIA's intelligence network was sophisticated, global, and merciless. Reports followed him like shadows, and false trails were sometimes indistinguishable from real ones. In one city, Che noticed a man sitting too still on a bench, eyes unervingly focused. He shifted his route, paused, and waited. The man eventually rose, moving with silent efficiency. Che knew then that the game had escalated. Agents were not only watching paths, but anticipating movements, trying to predict instinct, trying to outthink a man who had survived every conventional and unconventional assault. Crossing through Argentina, Che witnessed the varied faces of the world he had only glimpsed in theory. Rural villages clung to traditions, cities thrummed with commerce and politics, and everywhere, the whispers of revolution and counter-revolution intersected. The geography was as much a challenge as the enemy. Mountain passes threatened frostbite and exhaustion. Rivers swelled with rain, and every bridge or railway crossing presented risk. One misstep could deliver him directly into the hands of the CIA or local authorities complicit with them. Despite the danger, Che remained observant. He noted patterns, studied the routines of soldiers, and relied on the instincts that had carried him through jungles and cities alike. Every encounter was a test, not only of physical skill, but of perception and intuition. In one tense moment, he blended into a crowded train station, feeling the gaze of someone unfamiliar brush his shoulder. His hand brushed the edge of the revolver at his waist, a silent reminder that any second could become life or death. Yet the figure passed without incident, disappearing into the throng, leaving Che's heart pounding in rhythm with the train wheels. The psychological toll of constant vigilance weighed heavily. He slept lightly, aware that a single noise could betray him. Hunger gnawed, fatigue clawed at his body, yet he pressed onward. With every mile, the world became simultaneously smaller and more dangerous. The network of allies and enemies expanded, and Che moved within it like a shadow on the map, never stationary, never predictable. And yet, amid the danger, there was a strange exhilaration. The chase itself was a testament to survival, cunning, and willpower. Che allowed himself fleeting moments of reflection on the ideals that had driven him, equality, justice, the fight against oppression. These ideals were not abstract. They were the reason he moved through hostile terrain, evaded trained agents, and endured the gnawing uncertainty of life on the run. The personal cost was immense, but the vision that had carried him from Cuba to Bolivia, now stretching across borders, remained unbroken. One night, after a grueling day of crossing mountain passes and evading patrols, Che rested in a remote shelter. The firelight flickered across his tired face, shadows deepening the lines of exhaustion and resolve. He allowed himself a quiet moment of clarity. He thought of the hunt, of the agents plotting his capture, of the betrayals, and the dangers stretching ahead. And yet, despite the physical and emotional toll, he recognized a truth that had guided him through every campaign. Survival depended on strategy, intuition, and the courage to continue moving even when the world seemed intent on stopping him. The horizon beckoned. Beyond Argentina, beyond borders, beyond the reach of conventional power, the hunt would continue. Che's path was dangerous, but it was also deliberate. Every choice, every movement, every calculated risk brought him closer to survival, to his ideals, to the living proof that one man could defy an empire across continents. By dawn, Che slipped once again into the shadows of a small village, unnoticed, unseen. The jungle of South America had given way to plains and rivers, but the threat had not diminished. The CIA's reach was long, and the world watched, manipulated, and speculated. Yet Che moved like a ghost among the living, a legend across landscapes, hunted yet untouchable, defined not only by survival, but by the unyielding pursuit of a vision that stretched far beyond himself. The game of cat and mouse was global now, every mile a battlefield, every step a confrontation with mortality. And Che Guevara pressed onward, a fugitive, a revolutionary, a symbol, moving across continents with the certainty that for now he was still alive and still free. The rain fell in relentless sheets, pounding the tin roof of the abandoned shack where Che Guevara had taken temporary refuge. The smell of wet earth and decay filled the air, mingling with the iron tang of sweat and adrenaline. Che crouched low, listening intently to the jungle beyond. The storm masked some sounds, but the subtle rustle of movement, too calculated, too deliberate, cut through even the downpour. He knew it, they were close. Every escape, every maneuver over the past months had honed his senses. But tonight, instinct screamed a warning louder than ever. The CIA had grown relentless, their intelligence network tighter, their methods more daring. They had agents moving on multiple fronts, using informants, intercepting communications, and relying on the knowledge of local authorities sympathetic to their cause. For Che, every breath, every step, every heartbeat was measured against the possibility of death. He waited until the storm's intensity masked his movements and slipped silently through the mud, avoiding the main path where footprints could betray him. A faint light flickered in the distance, perhaps a lantern carried by hunters, perhaps just the reflection of lightning. Che's mind calculated distances, probabilities, escape routes. He moved like a shadow pressed against the trees, letting the storm provide cover as much as possible. Suddenly, a figure emerged, stepping into the clearing just a few meters ahead. Che froze, eyes narrowing. The man raised a hand, signaling, and Che realized the audacity of the operation. The CIA had moved an agent this close. The heart raced, but Che's training and instinct took over. He adjusted his path, using a fallen log to break line of sight, and moved parallel to the agent rather than confronting him directly. Every action was deliberate. One mistake could mean capture or death. The chase intensified as Che reached a river swollen with stormwater. The current was treacherous, but it was his only escape. With calculated agility, he plunged in, letting the water sweep him downstream. Branches lashed at him, but the momentum carried him beyond the reach of his pursuer. When he finally emerged on the opposite bank, soaked and bruised, the world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, relief washed over him, but he knew it was temporary. Che continued through the forest, moving at a pace dictated by instinct rather than urgency. Each footfall was deliberate, each rustle of leaves intentional. He knew that those who hunted him would anticipate his desperation, predict his movements. He had to be unpredictable, a phantom in a storm, untouchable in both mind and body. Later that night, he reached a small village on the edge of the jungle. Local allies had arranged temporary refuge, a small cabin abandoned except for a stack of firewood and a few supplies. Che's arrival was silent. He removed his boots, leaving them outside, and entered cautiously. Inside, he allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath, to assess injuries, and to review the narrow escapes of the past days. Every close call reinforced the reality. The CIA would not relent, but neither would he. His mind wandered to the personal cost of these narrow escapes. Each evasion required split-second decisions, improvisation, and sometimes betrayal of routine. The stress was relentless, the fear constant. He thought of comrades who had fallen, of allies who had disappeared into the night, of the countless faces of those who had been caught because they were careless or unlucky. Survival was not just about skill, it was about luck, timing, and the cold precision of decision-making under pressure. A sudden noise outside snapped him from his thoughts. Che crouched low again, pistol at the ready. A pair of figures moved toward the cabin, moving deliberately, yet not stealthily enough to fool him. He could feel their presence in the air, the heat of their bodies, the rhythm of their steps. They were close, but not close enough to see him yet. Che waited, counting, listening, calculating. He saw an opening and moved with lightning speed, slipping out the back of the cabin into dense undergrowth. The agents hesitated, scanning the area, unaware that the man they sought was already gone. Che ducked under branches, slipped over roots, and vanished into the darkness of the jungle, his movements fluid and precise, each step a blend of instinct and experience. Hours later, exhausted and soaked, Che found a high vantage point overlooking a small valley. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to observe, to assess. Below, he could see the faint glow of lanterns, agents searching, frustrated, misled by his deceptive maneuvers. A small, grim smile touched his lips. He had survived again. But survival was no longer simply physical. It was psychological, a matter of constantly outthinking, outmaneuvering, and staying 2 steps ahead of an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. The narrow escapes had taken a toll. His muscles ached, his mind was taut with tension, and every moment of rest was fleeting. Yet he remained resolute. The storm had passed, but the hunt was far from over. Che understood that each evasion strengthened him, not just physically, but mentally. He was being tested constantly, forced to adapt, innovate, and survive against a foe whose intelligence and resources were formidable. And still, amid the exhaustion and tension, Che felt the fire of determination burn brighter. The CIA could deploy agents, intercept messages, and tighten the noose, but they could not extinguish the will that had carried him across jungles, borders, and continents. The narrow escapes were reminders of mortality, yes, but also proof of resilience. Every evasion, every calculated risk, every heartbeat under pressure was a testament to his skill, his cunning, and his unyielding defiance. As dawn approached, Che slipped into a hidden path leading toward the mountains. The jungle behind him was alive with movement and tension. The world beyond awaited, dangerous and uncertain. And in that liminal space, between pursuit and freedom, danger and survival, Che Guevara pressed forward, hunted but unbroken, a ghost among men, a legend moving through shadows, ever one step ahead of the relentless hunt. The dawn light filtered through the thick canopy in thin, golden streaks, casting the jungle in a surreal, almost ethereal glow. For a brief moment, Che Guevara allowed himself to pause, to breathe, to simply exist outside the relentless rhythm of pursuit. The narrow escapes of the past weeks had left his body battered and exhausted, yet his mind was alive with reflection. In this fleeting calm, he could feel the weight of everything: the victories, the losses, the betrayals, and the relentless hunt that had followed him across forests, rivers, and continents. He crouched on a ridge overlooking a quiet valley, the air cool on his damp skin. The river below glimmered like a silver ribbon, winding lazily through the green expanse. The world seemed almost peaceful here, untouched by the chaos that defined his existence. But Che knew better. He had learned that calm was rarely natural. It was temporary, a deceptive lull that often preceded disaster. The storm would come again, in the form of men, bullets, betrayal, or the unforgiving terrain itself. The solitude gave him space to reflect on the paradox of his life. He had become a legend, admired and feared, a symbol whose name traveled farther than he ever could. Yet the reality was far harsher. He was hunted constantly, his body tested by exhaustion, his mind stretched by paranoia. He had trusted allies who had faltered under pressure, and he had seen comrades die for the ideals he held sacred. The jungle, once a place of refuge, had become both sanctuary and crucible, a mirror reflecting the tenuous balance between survival and sacrifice. Che's thoughts drifted to the ideology that had carried him from Cuba to Bolivia. He had believed in a world transformed by revolution, a world where equality, justice, and solidarity could overcome oppression. These ideals had shaped every step, every decision, every risk he had taken. And yet, in the quiet moments like this, he confronted the human cost, the exhaustion, the fear, the loneliness, and the unyielding knowledge that one wrong move could erase everything. The burden of being both man and symbol was heavier than any physical weight. He allowed himself to feel the fear he usually suppressed. It was subtle, like a shadow brushing against his consciousness, but it was there. The CIA was relentless, their network vast, their determination absolute. Every report, every informant, every patrol was designed to predict, trap, and eliminate him. He had survived by intuition, skill, and sheer willpower, but even legends could falter under unending pressure. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from the awareness that the calm he now felt was only temporary. Yet alongside the fear was clarity. In these rare moments, Che reflected on why he fought, why he endured, and why he refused to surrender. Survival was more than a physical act. It was a moral and intellectual stance. Each choice he made, each risk he took, was guided by principles that transcended immediate danger. He was a man pursuing a vision larger than himself, aware that his survival was not only for his own sake, but for the hope of those who believed in his cause. The calm allowed him to revisit memories, both painful and inspiring. Faces of fallen comrades flashed in his mind, each one a reminder of the stakes. The laughter and camaraderie of those early revolutionary days, the exhilaration of small victories, and the bitterness of betrayal and loss all mingled in a complex mosaic of emotion. Che realized that these experiences, both joyous and tragic, had forged him into the man who now crouched alone in the jungle, a fugitive yet unbroken. He thought of the hunt itself, the relentless pursuit that had defined his recent months. The CIA's network of agents, double agents, and informants was formidable, yet Che had learned to turn the chase into a crucible of resilience. Every narrow escape, every evasion, every deceptive maneuver had strengthened his resolve. He was not merely surviving. He was mastering the art of survival, shaping his responses to the pressures of pursuit with precision and discipline. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the canopy in brilliant hues, Che felt a sense of temporary equilibrium. He allowed himself to strategize, planning routes, contingencies, and signals with meticulous care. The calm was not idleness. It was preparation, mental sharpening for the challenges that would inevitably return with renewed intensity. He knew the storm would come again, but he also knew that when it did, he would be ready, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Amid this preparation, Che's thoughts wandered to the paradox of fame and anonymity. He was revered in distant lands, a symbol broadcast through newspapers, radio, and whispers. Yet here, in the jungle, he was almost invisible, a shadow among shadows. The duality was disorienting. Celebrated and hunted, idolized and targeted, a legend yet painfully human. It was a reminder that survival required constant vigilance, not just of the enemy, but of one's own mind. Che rose from a ridge, stretching stiff muscles, and taking a deep breath of the humid air. The jungle held no promises of safety, only possibilities shaped by skill, caution, and luck. He adjusted the straps of his bag, checked his weapon, and took one last glance at the valley below. For now there was still time, still space to move, to think, to breathe. The calm was fleeting, but it was enough to gather strength, enough to steel his resolve for the next phase of the hunt. The quiet of the morning was deceptive. Every rustle, every distant bird call, reminded him that danger was never far. Yet Che felt a renewed determination, a sharpened clarity that came from facing life and death so many times in rapid succession. The calm before the storm was a gift, a brief respite, but also a test of focus. How one used these moments could determine whether the next encounter would end in survival or annihilation. With deliberate steps, Che descended from the ridge, moving silently toward the next stage of his journey. Each step was measured, each breath conscious, each thought aligned with both survival and purpose. The hunt had paused, but it would resume, and Che Guevara would meet it with the same combination of cunning, resolve, and unyielding will that had carried him this far. The calm would not last. The storm was coming. The air in the village was thick with tension, a suffocating mixture of humidity, fear, and anticipation. Che Guevara crouched in the shadow of a crumbling adobe wall, surveying the narrow streets. Every alley, every doorway, every rooftop was a potential threat. He had been hunted across jungles, mountains, and plains, but this was different. The hunters were closer than ever, precise, ruthless, and patient. The CIA had refined its approach, integrating local forces and informants into a coordinated net designed to close in without warning. Che's instincts screamed that the trap was near. He observed patterns of movement, patrols synchronized with unusual precision, villagers who avoided his gaze, shadows lingering too long on rooftops. Every detail mattered, every anomaly a potential clue. He could feel the weight of the hunt pressing against him, the culmination of months of pursuit condensed into this tense moment. One misstep could be fatal. He adjusted his position, pressing himself flatter against the wall, letting the shadows obscure him. The men moving through the village were professionals, disciplined and alert. He recognized the signs immediately, the slight spacing between them, the silent gestures, the occasional radio whisper. They were tracking him, not just with eyes but with anticipation, attempting to predict instinct, to corner a man who had eluded them for months. Che's mind raced through contingencies. Escape routes had to be fluid, improvisation mandatory. Every building, every courtyard, every hidden stairway became part of a mental map. His pulse was steady, but his senses were razor-sharp, attuned to even the slightest movement. Survival at this point was not just a matter of speed or strength. It was calculation, anticipation, and nerve. The first move came suddenly. A shadow detached itself from a rooftop, descending toward a narrow street where Che had momentarily considered passing. He pivoted, slipping into a narrow alley just as a flash of movement and the muted bark of a rifle shattered the relative calm. The men were close. Too close. Che's mind moved faster than his body, analyzing angles, predicting their movements. He scaled a low wall, landing silently behind a stack of crates, eyes scanning the street below. The hunters paused, exchanging quiet gestures, unaware of his proximity. He had been hunted across continents, yet the thrill of survival was immediate, visceral. Each narrow escape had sharpened him, each close call a lesson in anticipation and intuition. From his vantage point, Che observed the coordinated sweep. Local authorities, CIA operatives, and informants converged with mechanical precision. The village had become a chessboard, every alley a line of attack. He knew the odds were stacked, yet he also understood the power of unpredictability. Every move he made now had to be untraceable, every step a deception designed to mislead, disorient, and survive. A sudden whistle cut through the air, an unmistakable signal. Che's heart skipped, but he moved with trained efficiency. He slipped through a hidden passage, barely wide enough for one man, leading into a dense grove at the village's edge. Branches tore at his clothing, roots snagged his boots, yet every obstacle became part of the camouflage, masking his movements. The hunters paused at the edge of the grove, scanning, calling quietly to each other. Che melted into the shadows, a phantom moving with silent resolve. The confrontation escalated as he reached the riverbank, the water swollen from recent rains. Across the river, faint lantern lights indicated the hunters' positions, converging like predators circling their prey. Che weighed his options: cross, backtrack, or hide. The river offered speed but risked detection. Backtracking was predictable. Hiding might only delay the inevitable. He chose the river, plunging into the cold current, letting it sweep him downstream, eyes fixed on the far bank. Bullets hissed through the air, splashing near him, but he moved with fluid efficiency, using the current to shield his position. Every second was a negotiation with fate, every breath a victory against imminent capture. When he emerged on the opposite bank, soaked and trembling, he paused only briefly, scanning the darkness for pursuit. None came immediately. The storm of months, the jungles, the betrayals, the propaganda, the global chase, had led to this moment, and Che had survived again. Yet he knew the final confrontation was not over. He had evaded death before, but now the hunters had learned, adapted, and coordinated in ways he had not yet encountered. The emotional weight of being hunted, fear, isolation, mistrust, and the constant calculation of survival, pressed heavily upon him. Each step forward carried the knowledge that a single miscalculation could end the pursuit forever. As he crouched among the reeds on the far riverbank, Che allowed a brief moment of reflection. The hunt had tested every skill he possessed: intellect, intuition, courage, and endurance. It had demanded the utmost resilience, forcing him to confront betrayal, isolation, and mortality at every turn. And yet, despite the relentless pursuit, he remained unbroken. Each narrow escape was a testament to his ability to survive, to outthink, to endure. The dawn began to break, casting long shadows across the water and forest. Che moved again, cautiously, silently, aware that the game was far from over. The final confrontation was not necessarily a single moment of violence. It was the culmination of strategy, resilience, and the ability to remain free against overwhelming odds. Somewhere across the river, agents regrouped, reassessing, adapting, planning the next move. But Che Guevara, soaked and weary, pressed onward, moving like a shadow through the forest, a legend still alive, still untouchable, still defining the narrative of the hunt. The cat-and-mouse game, stretched across continents and months, reached a peak, yet remained unresolved. Survival was not guaranteed, but Che's resolve, cunning, and indomitable will made him a force that could not be easily captured or tamed. The final confrontation, in its fullest sense, was not a single act. It was the relentless pressure, the testing of mind and body, the tension between hunter and hunted. And in that tension, Che thrived, a fugitive, a symbol, a man whose survival depended on both courage and intellect. The storm of pursuit had reached its zenith, yet he pressed on, a legend moving through the shadows, alive in both flesh and myth. The jungle had quieted, the river now a gentle ribbon of silver reflecting the early morning sun. Che Guevara paused on a ridge overlooking the expanse of land he had traversed, a survivor of countless traps, betrayals, and relentless pursuit. The physical exhaustion weighed on him, but the mental and emotional weight was even heavier. The memories of those he had lost, the sacrifices endured, the trust fractured and regained, and the constant knowledge that death had stalked him relentlessly across continents. Yet amid this exhaustion, there was clarity. Che understood that his survival was only part of the story. More profound was the life he had led, the ideals he had championed, and the influence he had exerted beyond the immediate scope of the hunt. His image, both vilified and glorified, had traveled faster than his physical form. Across radio waves, newspapers, and whispered conversations, he had become more than a man. He was a symbol of defiance, revolution, and the relentless pursuit of justice, as he understood it. Even as he moved through shadows and danger, Che contemplated the paradox of his existence. Hunted across forests, plains, and international borders, he had become untouchable yet intensely human. The CIA and allied forces had tried to define him, to reduce him to a target, to twist his image into propaganda. And yet, in every corner of Latin America, Europe, and beyond, his name inspired hope, fear, and reflection. The duality of man and symbol was a heavy burden, yet it was one he bore with unwavering resolve. He thought of the comrades who had fought and died alongside him, the friends who had faltered under pressure, the allies who had been compromised or captured. Every memory carried both sorrow and motivation. Their sacrifices had been part of a larger narrative, a testament to the costs of resistance and the weight of ideals. In that recognition, Che found both grief and strength, grief for the losses and strength to continue moving, thinking, and surviving. The jungle behind him was no longer simply a landscape of danger. It had become a reflection of life itself, unpredictable, fraught with peril, yet full of beauty and possibility. Every river crossed, every ridge climbed, every narrow escape had taught him lessons beyond mere survival. He had learned about human resilience, the fragility and strength of trust, the subtle power of perception, and the indomitable capacity of a determined mind. Che reflected on the philosophical underpinnings of his life. Revolution, he realized, was not only about guns and battles. It was about ideas, ideals, and the enduring struggle against systems that oppressed, exploited, and silenced. The CIA had pursued him with unparalleled precision, using every tool available to neutralize a man whose power lay not only in action, but in symbolism. And in their efforts, they had inadvertently amplified his legend. The cat-and-mouse game, spanning continents and months, had forged a narrative that no single bullet or operation could erase. For all the danger he faced, Che found moments of profound awareness in his solitude. The jungle, the river, the mountains, all became mirrors reflecting both the external and internal battles he waged. Survival was no longer merely physical. It was an exercise of intellect, spirit, and conviction. Each step he took in the shadows reinforced a truth that he had long understood. Ideals and legacy often outlast the immediate threats of life and death. He considered the world beyond the jungle. The propaganda campaigns, the global discourse, the ideological battles fought in newspapers, radio waves, and whispered conversations. His presence had shifted narratives, challenged authority, and inspired countless individuals to question, to resist, and to dream of a different world. Even the CIA's efforts to hunt him had, paradoxically, solidified his status as a symbol, a reminder that ideas, once ignited, could not be easily extinguished. Che's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the emotional journey he had endured. Betrayal, isolation, relentless pursuit, and the constant proximity of death had tested every aspect of his being. Yet in those trials, he had discovered the limits and the strength of human resilience. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it, that loyalty was fragile but essential, and that survival depended on both intellect and instinct. The early morning sun grew warmer, illuminating the expanse before him. Che stood on the ridge, momentarily still, letting the vastness of the world settle into his consciousness. The hunt had shaped him, the betrayals had tested him, and the narrow escapes had strengthened him. Yet he knew that his life, his legend, was defined not by the pursuit alone, but by the ideals he carried, the courage he inspired, and the enduring hope he represented. As he descended into the valley, moving silently, Che understood that the world would continue to chase him, to interpret him, and to debate him long after any single confrontation. The CIA might strike again, agents might pursue, and the shadows of betrayal could linger. But the essence of what he had become, the symbol, the revolutionary, the man who defied capture across continents, was untouchable. Survival, after all, was temporary. Legacy was eternal. In the quiet, Che whispered a final affirmation, not to any human, but to the ideals that had guided him across mountains, jungles, and rivers. They can chase the body, but they cannot capture the spirit. They can hunt the man, but they will never own the legend. And with that, Che Guevara moved forward, a man hunted yet unbroken, a symbol forged in the crucible of pursuit, a legend whose story would echo across generations, continents, and ideologies. The chase had ended for now, but the impact endured, immortalized in the lives inspired, the ideals spread, and the courage witnessed. The world would remember not only the hunter and the hunted, but the ideals that survived beyond both, because legends, once born, cannot be captured, only lived.